All right, you ready to go? Cool. Well, thanks all for coming to our kickoff of Students for Ballot PA. We really appreciate your time, and we appreciate all of those who are here with us today, as well as those who will be watching later recordings of this on our website. My name is Harry Ho. I'm a student at Swarthmore College, and I'm a sophomore. And in conjunction with Louisa Hanson, who you'll meet in a bit, and Kay Baker, we are the co-chairs of Students for Ballot PA, which is a subsection, I would say, of Ballot PA, which is chaired by David Thornburg, who we're fortunate to have here today. So we are planning to do a short overview of what Ballot PA really is after introductions. We're going to cut out the introductions for the later recording. So faces and names are not there, but for context, for people watching later, that's why you might see a little slide jump. And then we're going to talk about what really Ballot PA is and the case for open primaries. What are open primaries in the first place? Why are we even doing that? What Students for Ballot PA really is, and then we're fortunate enough to have Daryl from Students for Open Primaries at the national level joining us to be our guest speaker. And then we would like to conclude with a short snippet on what we're hoping that you can do for us. And we have different ladders of engagement, which Kay is going to touch more briefly on later on. And then we're going to close off with a $25 Our Sheets gift card of your choice. So, our conversation. So next up, we're going to have David speak a little bit about what open primary or the primary problem is and where we go from there.
Great, Harry. And I just want to take a second and thank Harry and Louisa and Kay for organizing this. This all started with a conversation that Louisa and I had some weeks ago, but for the last 3 Saturdays, I think, at 2 o'clock, we planned this, and each of them reached out to you folks, and that's how this stuff happens. It starts with a couple people, and then a few more, and then a few more, and after a while, you have a really energetic and effective force. So you all have talked around a number of issues that I think really come back to the theme that we're going to talk about. And that's this. We've been focused on this fact that I think, and I hope you'll agree, has unfortunate consequences for how democracy works in Pennsylvania. That is the fact that Pennsylvania is one of only 9 states that completely excludes independent voters from voting in primary elections. So maybe you knew that, maybe you don't know that, you know it now. If you are not a Republican or a Democrat in Pennsylvania, unlike 41 other states, you have no voice in primary elections, in the first round of elections that contribute to selecting the candidates that ultimately stand in front of all voters. And we formed Ballot PA, launched it this April. You can see the All PA in Ballot PA on the simple notion that every Pennsylvania voter deserves a vote in every election. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's what we're here to talk about and to enlist your support. So Harry, why don't you go to the next one? So I just gave you the sort of fact. And the question is, well, what difference does it make? Unfortunately, we've learned that the people who vote in primary elections tend to be a small fraction of the majority. And for reasons I think we can understand, they tend to be highly polarized, meaning they come from the extremes of both parties, which adds to this level of, let's say, vitriol and accusation, and frankly leaves most of the rest of voters exhausted by the fighting that goes on, the constant fighting, and as I said, the demonization of others, the folks in the other party. We spend much more time attacking people in the other party and not enough time thinking about what we actually stand for. then not surprisingly, if that's the kinds of elections we run, when we elect those people to our state capital or to Washington, they end up having very little interest in working with each other to solve the problems that we hope they can solve. So that's what leads to this sense of gridlocked and this endless, negative cycle of hyper-partisanship that we're seeing these days. Go on to the next one, Harry. Further consequences, that all of that kind of political fighting that goes on lowers voter turnout among the exhausted majority, because people think like, this is so unpleasant, I don't want anything to do with it, I'll stay home, thank you very much. It also means that special interests dominate primary elections. As I said, if we elect, if a small percentage of elected voters come out and dominate primary elections, then it's not surprising that they're not carrying with them the general interest of all voters. And then not surprisingly as well, that campaigns concentrate on that base of voters and not reaching out to more voters to encourage them to get involved and express their opinions. This is where I think this next bullet point really brings home what's at stake, which says most state and local elections, I know this is true of Pennsylvania, so this is for mayor or city council or county commissioner or state representative or state senator, 80% to 90% of those elections are now effectively decided in the primary, meaning that there is no opposition in the general election. So the person who wins the primary is automatically essentially elected in the general, or the nature of the electorate in a particular place is so lopsided that if you win that primary, you win the general. I live in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a 7-to-1 Democratic registration edge. And that means that once you win the Democratic primary, you basically have won the election. You get only token opposition in the fall. So what we end up with is elections that are decided by a sliver of the electorate. And let me just play that out in this next slide. So look at the 2022 primary I'm going to focus on the Senate races and the governor's races, which those of you in Pennsylvania, particularly if you've been watching the Phillies games, which I hope you all are, you can't avoid the endless carpet bombing of commercials these days. So you probably just wish it were over. In the primary, again, because only a small percentage of people vote in primary elections, in the Democratic primary for Senate, only 1 in 5 registered Democrats decided their nominee. In the Republican governor's race, 1 in 6. And in the governor's race on the Republicans, on the Senate race on the Republican side, 1 in 8. So you can just do the math, and you can see again, this demonstrates how a small vocal minority, what some person called the furious few, are essentially deciding our elections. So go ahead, Harry. So here is a solution that we've been pursuing, which is to broaden the base of primary elections by allowing independent voters to choose a primary election in which they participate without having to join the political party. And I'll just say this is, I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania is one of only 9 states that locks out independents, but states that have adopted this kind of approach include, for instance, the state of Maine, the state of Virginia, New Hampshire and Massachusetts have had a variation on this. Colorado adopted this about 6 years ago. North Carolina adopted this kind of approach maybe 20 years ago. So it guarantees that, again, every registered voter has a chance to express their vote in the primary election. So let me just say a couple more words here, Harry. Next slide. I want to just tee up, this is one of the short videos that we've done that tries to make this argument, I think, in about a minute 17. And let me just play this clip just so you maybe reinforce some of what I've just been talking about. We have a sound problem, I think.
Harry, are you muted? You're muted. I think if you unmute, it should work.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Let's try that again.
Let's
Every
roll this.
Pennsylvanian
How's that?
Yep,
All right.
take it back to the beginning.
wants their voice.
Here we go.
Every Pennsylvanian wants their voice to be heard, Republican, Democrat, or Independent. Millions register to vote, to put their principles into action with the power of a ballot. But in the birthplace of American liberty, some 1.1 million Pennsylvania voters are barred from participating in primary elections for school board, for council, for state legislator, for governor, for federal representatives, and even president. It's taxation without representation. That's why leaders in both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have come together to support a plan backed by huge majorities of conservatives, moderates, and progressives to repeal closed primaries. The plan would give registered independents the right to vote in both the primary and general elections without having to join a party. All voting Pennsylvanians, all political viewpoints, voting in every election, just the way the founders wanted it. Act now. Sign the petition at ballotpa.org. Urge state lawmakers to let independents vote so that the place where America's big ideas started isn't the last to repeal closed primaries. Every voter, every election. Ballotpa.org. Repeal closed primaries.
All right.
There you go. The whole truth in a minute 17. Harry, go to the next slide now, and then I'll just say a couple more words and pass it.
Every Pennsylvanian.
Whoops. Okay, so this is where you come in. We did some extensive research looking at independent voters in Pennsylvania. In fact, when I say we, I mean mostly Louisa, who did a great job in nailing all this down. And here's a couple things we found out. One is this is one of, if not the fastest growing segment of the electorate in Pennsylvania. So that 1.1 million people has been growing steadily, sometimes rapidly over the last 20 years. It's about 15% of the electorate. It's geographically concentrated. You can see on the map that it's concentrated in the southeast and up into the northeastern part of the state. But again, here's where you come in. One of the things that jumps out is that several types of voters are much more likely to register as independents. Young voters, that would be you. 1 in 2 young voters choose to register as independents. 1 in 2, so 50%. Hispanic voters, Asian voters, Indian voters are also much more likely to register as independents. Another point that we've been trying to emphasize and double down on is that 1 in 2 veterans identify as independents. So these are the folks, and you are the folks who really are, we believe, unfairly locked out of elections. Again, elections that often are the only election. So if you don't get to vote in a primary election because you're registered as an independent, then you have no voice in who represents you. And we make the point about veterans that, you know, the irony there is that you serve your country, you take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution and our government, put your life on the line, you come home as an independent voter and you're shut out of even choosing who your commander-in-chief would be. So that's what it's that data point, particularly for young voters, 50% of young voters registered independents, that motivates the creation of Students for Ballot PA. And that's really the underpinning. And this is all, by the way, included in a white paper, which will be an assignment for future reference. But I think, am I turning over to Darielle, Harry, or do you want me to take questions if there are any? What do you want me to do?
We're gonna go right into Students for Ballot PA, which I think Louisa is gonna talk about.
Great.
Thanks, David.
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So David did touch on some of these statistics, but I just kind of wanted to drive home the point of why should students care about ballot PA? Why should students care about open primaries? So 24% of independent voters are aged 18 to 29, but only 15% of the entire electorate is aged 18 to 29. So young voters are overrepresented among the ranks of independents. And young voters are also geographically concentrated. As David mentioned, you can see a darker orange bit in the middle of the state. That's State College. You've also got independent voters concentrated in the Oakland neighborhood of Pittsburgh, which is where Carnegie Mellon, Pitt, and Carlow are located. You've also got concentration just around other universities like IUP and Slippery Rock out in Western PA. So folks living in college towns and college students are much more likely to register independent. And so independent voters being excluded is very relevant for both college students in these areas and the surrounding folks, the surrounding voters. And again, as David mentioned, 1 in 2 first-time registrants identify as independent. So we put together Students for Ballot PA as a special leadership group to speak with the voices of college students, either from or living in Pennsylvania, as to why closed primaries are harmful to young voters and why young voters ought to care about opening up primaries. So essentially, if you look at 1 in 2 first-time registrants and identifying as independent and registering as independent, and then they show up to the polls, their first time voting in a primary election, and are told, sorry, you can't vote. And that's not a good way to start out your political engagement. It's not going to make you want to come back and vote in the general. We have stats in our white paper, again, as David mentioned, that turnout is depressed among independents in general elections. And we hypothesize that this is because independents are largely shut out of the political system because of closed primaries. And then if independents are disproportionately made up of young people are being shut out of the political system at much higher rates. And again, as David mentioned, if a politician is just pandering to their base in the primaries and young people are not part of that base, politicians are not going to care about or prioritize what is important to young people as a whole. So essentially, what Students for Ballot PA boils down to is both fairness and setting a trend of inclusivity for young voters in the political sphere. We want to force politicians to, again, ignore us at their own peril. We want to increase the power of young voters, and we do so by increasing the number of elections and the power that young voters have. Yeah, so that's all from me. I'm going to turn this over to Dario, the National Chair of Students for Open Primaries.
Thanks, Lisa.
Hey y'all, my name is Daryl. I work with Students for Open Primaries. I got started with Students for Open Primaries by working on a similar initiative that you guys are doing in Pennsylvania, but in Florida. It was a ballot measure, it wasn't a ballot. Yes, it was a ballot measure, rather than a legislative bill. And so one piece of advice I can give to you guys as organizers for the similar issue is don't lose focus of what the end goal is, and that's letting I'm not sure how the statistics are in Pennsylvania, but in Florida it's about 1 point something million voters in Florida that are locked out of their primaries. I'm sure it's similar in Pennsylvania. Just don't lose hindsight of those millions of voters that are not able to vote in the primaries that will be able to with open primaries. I wanted to share some data with you guys from a recent survey that Students for Open Primaries does. Basically, Students for Open Primaries is a national organization dedicated to educating young voters about open primaries and conducting research on how closed primaries affects young voters. We just recently finished a survey, a national survey, about 1,000 participants, where we identified a bunch of key issues with closed primaries. For example, in our survey, about 65%, a supermajority of young people consider themselves independent. And even more telling as the reason why they are independent is that 80% of young voters believe elected leaders are more loyal to the party rather than constituents. And so this is really about developing better legislators, legislators of character, not of party. And open primaries is an important step to take towards that. There's several other organizations also getting into the open primary space, from the Committee of 70 to Forward Party and so many more. And so even if you necessarily, even when your work finishes in Pennsylvania for open or closed primaries, there's a lot of work to do now on the national scale. And I am more than welcome to help you identify where your U-shaped hole is So I will drop my email in the chat. If any of you guys wanted to reach out to me, I will be more than happy to connect you guys with organizations, including Ballot PA, that are working towards open primaries and nonpartisan election reform issues.
Thanks, Dario. Super helpful and good advice. Up next, I think Kay is going to share a little bit about what anyone who's college aged could do to help us.
Okay, so two things you guys can do now to really help this project is sign our petition. I'm gonna drop that in the chat for you guys to do yourselves, and then as well as sign up for our January mobilization event. That's going to be January 15th. There'll be more details to come as we get closer to January, more about the event and how to sign up and what is included. And then two things you guys can do relatively soon is just sharing your story on social media, especially written or video, and just making getting this word out there to to other students, your friends, professors, getting this involved in your school clubs or just anyone you know that would really be interested in learning more or wanting to participate in it. And then two things you guys can really do to help us later in the long term is read the white papers and just educate yourself more on what's going on with the politics and independent voting, and as well as just ultimately talking to your legislator. That's always I think a great thing to do, and get feedback from other people and people that are in this area of work.
Thanks, Kay.
Hey, Harry, can I just, before we get to the fun stuff, I just want to prolong the suspense on the raffle. Can I just drop in a couple other things?
Please do.
Okay. First of all, I mean, Dario sort of mentioned this. In Pennsylvania, this is a legislative process that we have to pursue. So we simply, but it's difficult, need to get a bill passed in the state house, a bill passed in the state senate, and then a governor to sign the piece of legislation. So it doesn't require a ballot initiative and all of that stuff. We've been working this year. We've gotten it. We're pleased with where we ended up this year, but we still have a ways to go, and so we're going to attack this again next year. So we're now looking forward to the way we're organizing and strategizing to get this on the docket and done next year. But I wanted to say one other thing, which is a general comment. Louisa sort of mentioned this earlier about young voters, which is not just relevant to independent voters, but I think it's sort of doubly significant if you were young and an independent voter, which is simply this. If you look at who votes, particularly in state and local elections, it's basically your grandparents. 65 plus. That's the most reliable voters that politicians pay attention to. So I'll say this, if you're okay with that, if you're okay with your grandparents making decisions about who represents you, then fine, stay home, do whatever. But if you're not, and I'm presuming you're not because you're here tonight, then you owe it to yourself and to your friends and colleagues to get active. And I'd suggest that given what we know, that Dario, this is new news, that 65% of young voters nationally identify as independents. That's almost 2/3. So we're past 50%. We're now 2/3. If that's the values that you and your people your age bring to this, we owe it to them and to you to fight as hard as we can to make sure that they're included. Because otherwise, here we go again. Your grandparents will continue to sustain the type of politics that we have. So I just wanted to underline those 2 points and also give you a sense of where we were in terms of this campaign. So now we'll get to the fun part. Now we'll get to the actual reason for being here, right, Louisa?
Sure. I want to say one thing for the recording, because this is probably where it's going to end with what we're going to put on the website. if you have any other questions, our emails will be listed on the page, and we always are welcoming any thoughts, any questions that you might have, because this is only incumbent on everyone to pitch in to make this possible. But I just wanted to say that and express our gratitude again for you tuning in and hearing a little bit about what Ballot PA is and what Students for Ballot PA is. And now I think we're good.
Yeah, I just wanted to say also, thank you all so much. As a native Pennsylvanian who is no longer living in Pennsylvania for now, we'll see. I want to give a special thank you to anyone who's watching who's engaged who's not originally from Pennsylvania. I appreciate it tremendously that folks are stepping in to help improve the political landscape in my home state that I can't do everything that I would like to be able to do from Canada. So yeah, special thank you to the folks who didn't grow up in Pennsylvania, but still loved it enough to help fight for it. So I appreciate that tremendously. And yeah, now on to the fun part, the raffle. So it's a little bit anticlimactic. I just put everyone's names in the online raffle generator, and our winner is Victor. Who has left for a meeting with someone he's advising, but I will send him his Wawa gift card over the course of the next week.
Go Vic, and we'll in suspense as to whether he's choosing Wawa or Sheets.
There's no suspense. Victor's my friend from high school. He is choosing Wawa. Philadelphia.
Okay, he'd be a real traitor to Philadelphia and Southeast if he was if he went Sheets all of a sudden. Huh?
Yeah, no, there's no way.
Gotta have a Wawa.
Exactly.
Well, Louisa, we'll work out. I will put on my credit card or whatever I need to do to get that
Great.
done. Can I just say, if there are, we're actually running a little bit ahead of schedule. And Harry kind of asked that. Are there questions or comments from folks that are new to this that you want to ask now rather than just by email?
This is maybe tangential, but just thinking of other initiatives that are helpful for like some of the main goals of allowing more people's voice to be more important. Mm-hmm. How does ranked choice voting as like potentially a separate goal to be addressed after opening primaries fit into like Ballot PA's agenda?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben. It comes up often. Ranked choice voting is, by the way, can lay claim to basically been born and raised in Philadelphia. Two of the main proponents are, I think one's a Haverford graduate, one's a Swarthmore graduate, maybe. So it's a very Quakerly kind of thing. I would say the discussion around ranked choice voting is fairly early stage in Pennsylvania. It still feels a little foreign, unknown. People, start talking about how it's confusing or whatever. And, what we've said in trying to position what we're doing is, let's get this done. Let's broaden the base with 1.1 million voters. And then let's take a look and see if that is sufficient to get where we want to be, which is political candidates who are embraced by a broad cross-section of the electorate. So it's sort of a stage one, stage two, but it's also a calculation that this may be, while it's not easy to do, maybe easier to do than a full-bore campaign for ranked choice voting. So you get that? It's just sort of trying to gauge where the politics are on this, but it doesn't at all preclude that further down the line.
Good question.
Yep, great question.
Hassan, any Haverford questions?